Hey guys, Potato McWhiskey here, and today we're going to be asking and answering one simple question. Are national parks or rock bands more effective for tourism generation? They both use faith, so which one is more cost effective? This question actually came from a comment from Siddharth Venkatesh. Did my best to pronounce that correctly, but I'm not super familiar with what I assume is an Indian name. His question was as follows. Curious if you still find national parks worth it for their faith cost. Rock bands seem so effective at the moment, I've started to just gun for Cold War, get faith production to 300 plus, and just spam rock bands every other turn, leaving little room for naturalists. You did say you prefer to wait till the end game card, but they seem more cost effective even without it. One park is still nice for era score and the Eureka, of course. This is a fantastic comment for a number of reasons, because it's going to give me an opportunity to talk about late game tourism, as well as go into a lot of detail about how tourism itself works from a mathematical standpoint. I'm going to give a very simple analogy to illustrate the difference between the two and how they should be used, and then I'm going to go into depth on the theory, mathematics, and mechanics behind it. So first, I want you to imagine a civilization's domestic tourists generated from their culture output as if they were building towers. Every time they get enough culture to generate a domestic tourist, their tower gets a little bit taller. Imagine their domestic tourists stacked on top of each other. Now imagine every civilization is doing this and everyone's tower is at a different height because everyone has generated a different amount of culture. What you're trying to do when you're winning a tourism victory is to use tourism pressure, which is individually calculated against each tower, to steal blocks from other people's towers and build a new tower using those stolen blocks that is taller than the tallest domestic tourist tower of any other player. Using this analogy, we can think of national parks as undermining the other player's culture towers. Because national parks apply their tourism to every other player in the game, it is effectively stealing a block from every person's tower over a period of turns. This makes them really effective at building a really big tourism tower over a long period of time, since they're taking blocks passively, forever, from everyone. Rock bands, on the other hand, can be thought of like a SEAL team targeted block raid at a particular tower. They steal blocks from only one of the towers, which makes that particular tower shorter and your offensive tower taller. Mechanically speaking, that means it's best to target rock bands against the player with the biggest culture tower, since you need to make your tourism tower taller than the biggest culture tower. Targeting someone who doesn't have the biggest culture tower will still make your tourism tower bigger, but the real power of rock bands is making the biggest culture tower smaller and your tourism tower bigger at the same time, effectively closing the gap between the two. That's the simplest explanation of the mechanics behind tourism. If you understand that example, then you now completely intuitively understand the culture victory, even if you don't know any of the numbers or theory. National parks are for building your tourism tower by stealing blocks over a long period of time, and rock bands are for crippling the culture tower you're trying to beat over a short period of time. So the simple answer is that national parks are better in the early and mid game when stealing as many blocks as possible is the goal, and in the late game rock bands are better for when you only have one person to beat and you need to steal blocks specifically from their tower. If you close the video now, technically speaking, you should be able to reach all of the conclusions that follow if you have the same information. Now, before I can continue and answer this question in depth, I have to make sure that everyone who is watching understands how tourism works numerically. It's mostly straightforward and simple once you understand it, but there can be a bit of an understanding leap. This will just be the compressed version because I plan to do an in-depth tutorial on culture and tourism itself at a later date. First of all, each civilization has three types of tourists: domestic tourists, foreign tourists, and visiting tourists. Domestic tourists are basically your defense against culture victories. You gain domestic tourists by generating culture per turn or through civic boosts. Effectively, these are blocks you use to build your culture tower. Foreign tourists are tourists who have left your pool of domestic tourists and have gone on to visit another civilization. These are tourists you have lost and other players use them to build their tourism towers. Visiting tourists are tourists who have been attracted from another player's pool of domestic tourists to come and visit your country. You attract visiting tourists by generating tourism. This is what you use to build your tourism tower. If we want to get really simple, there's only one type of tourists, which are all generated from culture. What we name a tourist is dependent on where that tourist is and whose perspective we are looking at it from. From my perspective, any of my tourists visiting another civilization is a foreign tourist, and from the perspective of the civilization they are going to, they are visiting tourists. You win a tourism victory when the total number of visiting tourists in your civilization is larger than the player with the most amount of domestic tourists. That's why we want to build our tourism tower taller than the biggest culture tower to win. This final piece of information is key to understanding the line between national parks and rock bands. We will come back to this, but first we have to know exactly how tourism is applied by rock bands and national parks. National parks apply their tourism to every civilization in the game every single turn, and rock bands apply their tourism to a single civilization. Now, that's if you don't count the goes to 11 promotion for rock bands, which does allow them to apply their tourism to multiple players, but that's the exception to the rule. This means that their role in the tourism victory are different, even if they both do fundamentally the same thing, which is converting faith into tourism. The difference in how they apply their tourism dictates how and when they should be used. National parks generate tourism per turn. Tourism per turn is very interesting because a lot of multipliers can apply to it. Let's take the bare minimum example of a national park that has exactly 4 appeal on every single tile. A national park generates tourism based on the appeal of all of its tiles. So in this example, the national park generates 16 tourism per turn. That 16 tourism per turn is applied to every civilization you have met. So 16 tourism per turn in a game where there are 5 other players is multiplied by 5 to get a total effective output of 80 tourism per turn. That means you can expect a baseline national park with no multipliers to generate a tourist every 13 to 25 turns. Now, where does that number come from? Well, we need to explain how tourism pressure is applied and calculated before I can answer that. In an average game of Civilization 6, it takes 200 to 400 tourism per turn to generate a visiting tourist on average per turn. The reason the number is variable is because it depends on the number of players in the game. How much tourism it costs to take a tourist from another player's tower is calculated as 200 times the number of players in the game. In a 2-player game, it's 200 times 2, which is 400. In a 6-player game, it's 200 times 6, which is 1200. In an 8-player game, it's 1600. And in a 16-player game, it's 3200. Now, our national park generates 16 tourism per turn. That means we can take the above numbers and divide them by 16 to see how long it would take our national park to steal a tourist from an individual civilization's culture tower. 400 divided by 16 is 25, which means it takes a national park generating 16 tourism 25 turns to steal a tourist in a 2-player game. In the 8-player game, a visiting tourist costs 1600 tourism, which means it would take 100 turns for a national park to steal a tourist from an individual civilization's culture tower. However, remember, a national park generates tourism pressure against every single civilization in the game. So we can divide that 100 number by 7 because there are 7 other players that we are generating tourism against. 100 divided by 7 is roughly 14.3, which means in an 8-player game, we can expect the average return on investment from a national park to be 1 visiting tourist stole from another player every 14.3 turns. The reality of what's happening is that every 100 turns, the national park is stealing a tourist from every civilization in the game at the exact same time. This is really important information because it tells us 2 things. National parks are more valuable the earlier you build them because they have a longer time to pay themselves off in the form of attracting tourists. And it also tells us that tourism victories are easier the more players are in a game from a numerical standpoint. Practically speaking, there are usually other issues that make that not a reality. For example, in a larger game with more players, there's a higher probability for competition over great people and wonders, which offsets this numerical advantage to some extent, and it can vary from game to game based on a lot of different factors. Now, this also tells us that we can actually multiply our base tourism generated per turn by the number of alive players in the game to get our effective base tourism per turn. The alive player part matters since you can't generate tourism against a dead civilization or a civilization that you haven't met. Which, by the way, if you're losing a culture victory, you can buy yourself some time by murdering civilizations, since that removes all of their tourists from the games, even the ones that have already been taken by other players. In an 8-player game, killing another civilization completely effectively cuts everyone's tourism generation by about 14%, since killing a civilization doesn't make it cheaper to earn tourists. So again, in the example of making 16 tourism per turn in an 8-player game, we're effectively making 112 tourism per turn. If you divide 1600 by 112, you also get 14.3. Roughly speaking, it's just about doing the same maths in a slightly different way. Base tourism is very interesting though because a lot of different modifiers can be applied to it, and there is a point where they stack multiplicatively rather than additively. For example, the technology, computers, and the civic environmentalism both increase the base tourism per turn by 25% each, so combined they give you a 50% bonus to your base tourism per turn. In our previous example, we would be generating 24 base tourism per turn with both of these bonuses, since 16 multiplied by 1.5 is 24. Then that tourism is multiplied based on individual multipliers with each individual civilization. Having open borders with a civilization gives you a 25% modifier for tourism against that civilization, as does having a trade with them, meaning if you have both, you get another 50% modifier modifier. That bonus stacks multiplicatively with the computers and environmentalism bonus. So the 24 tourism we were generating becomes 36 instead of the 32 if they stacked additively. This is especially relevant with the online community cards that brings the total bonus from a trade route to 75%, which means that base 16 tourism, with the right bonuses, technologies and diplomacy, can easily generate up to 48 effective tourism per turn per civilization in the game. If you have open borders and trade routes with every single civ, that means a single national park is generating 336 effective tourism per turn spread across 7 players, which means we can expect it to generate a visiting tourist every 4.75 turns, roughly speaking. I haven't even started talking about things like the Eiffel Tower, great people, and other modifiers that can lead to absurdly high modifiers. The list of modifiers that can affect this and the strategies behind managing diplomacy is pretty in-depth, so we'll leave it there for now, and we'll revisit that in the later video. Okay, so we understand that tourism you get from national parks is base tourism and can be multiplied by 7 different modifiers to effectively generate massive amounts of visiting tourists. How does that information make us able to decide if it's better to invest in faith into naturalists or rock bands? Well, the main distinction is that rock bands do not generate base tourism. They generate direct tourism against a civilization, and that is not affected by modifiers based on all of my testing. If a rock band generates 1000 tourism against a civilization, that's it. That's all the tourism it would ever generate, and it only generated it against a single civilization and no modifiers apply. It would take a completely basic national park with no modifiers roughly 9 turns to generate the same amount of total tourism, and the national park will keep generating that tourism every single turn beyond that and can continue to be affected by new modifiers we pick up along the way. Using this information and this example, we can very easily deduce that if a rock band and a national park cost roughly the same amount of faith, it would be better to invest in a national park if we expect the game to last more than 9 more turns. Now, oftentimes a national park costs 2 to 3 times more than a rock band, so we have to multiply the number of turns that the national park has to exist by 2 to 3, so it's more like we need the game to last 20 to 30 turns for a national park to be more cost effective than a rock band. This will scale based on how many national parks you built and can technically be infinite, but I find the average game it goes up to about 3 times the price of a rock band consistently, so I use about 30 turns left in the game before I decide to start investing in rock bands. You can calculate how many turns you expect to be left in the game by your expected tourists per turn versus the tourist per turn of the player with the most domestic tourists per turn. Jesus, try to say that 10 times fast. Okay, so for example, I'd make 1000 base tourism against 7 civilizations in an 8-player game. After multipliers, my effective tourism is about 2000 tourism per turn on average, which is about 8.5 tourists per turn. The strongest culture player is generating 400 culture per turn, which means he's generating 4 domestic tourists per turn, which is effectively about 3 per turn because I'm stealing one of them every single turn. If they have 90 more domestic tourists than I have visiting tourists, that means I can expect the game to end in about 15 turns because I'm effectively gaining about 5 to 6 visiting tourists per turn relative to his domestic tourist generation. Now, I'm not going to ask you to sit down and calculate all these numbers in the game. I don't do that ever, unless I'm wondering how long a game will take and whether it's worth to keep optimizing or just start hitting end turn until I get the win screen. I go by a very simple rule of thumb that is inefficient but safe, and I've won many games using this rule set. It's not the most effective or efficient way to play, but it is consistent and safe. The rule of thumb is as follows. I will only invest faith into national parks until my tourism per turn is more than double the culture per turn of the player with the largest domestic tourist tower. And I have more domestic tourists than every civilization in the game except for the player with the most domestic tourists. Or until I unlock the card that allows me to pick any promotion from my rock bands. This strategy is based upon the logic that a domestic tourist costs 100 culture to generate and it takes 200 to 400 tourism to steal it. So if a player is making 500 culture and I'm making 100 base tourism per turn, that means I'm likely stealing more tourists per turn than they are generating in an average game depending on the number of players in it. So it would be more efficient to start knocking down their tourist tower with rock bands to close the gap faster than I would if I were just adding on more national parks. Rock bands also become so incredibly efficient with generating tourism against a civilization when you're able to pick whatever promotion you want that the expected value from investing in them is so obviously better than adding more national parks that this is also when I make the switch. Part of the reason I'm dubious about investing in rock bands when you unlock them is that the RNG behind them is double layered. You have to roll the dice on the promotion that you get and whether you'll be able to survive through their use. I know the number says 33% chance to retire on use, but this is Firaxis we're talking about, about, and if we know anything, a 33% chance is more like a 90% chance to miss, at least if you've played any XCOM games. If you can pick the promotion though, you're only rolling that dice once, and the expected failure rate is lower, since you're guaranteed more success by picking the right promotions. I would go as far as to say that rock bands become exponentially better once you can pick any promotion for them, since the expected return for investment goes up by a square or cubic value, since they generate more tourism per action and are more likely to survive to do another action. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't the most efficient way to play. This is a fairly simple and safe way to play. A far more efficient way to play would be to do the actual calculations on when a rock band versus a national park is more cost effective for a faith investment. If you're able to do that consistently, you could easily shave a dozen or more turns off your culture victories. I personally just don't enjoy the process involved with achieving that level of efficiency. I'm much happier developing effective, simple strategies that are safe bets, even if they are a little bit slower than the technically optimal way to play, because I don't like optimizing away the fun of a game. I would rather hit end turn a few more times over a 30-minute period than spend 10 minutes doing calculations and ending the game in 20 minutes. So if you were following along, holy crap, I am amazed at you because I'm really bad at explaining things and this is a confusing topic. But the conclusion basically boils down to this. A national park is better in the early game and rock bands are better later in the game. Where exactly this point is, shifting between investing one or the other, is difficult to exactly calculate because the amount of tourism you get from rock bands is randomized, making it difficult for you to make that decision. Since it's possible to be at a point in the game where a rock band could, depending on how well it rolls the dice, generate more or less tourism than investing in a national park for the same amount of faith. So I basically wait until I know for 100% certain that no matter what, when I invest in a rock band, I am guaranteed a higher return than a national park. This is typically when I'm 20 to 30 turns away from winning passively, and I use rock bands to cut that down by about 10 to 15 turns. Another small consideration is that national parks always give you era score, which can be used to chain together golden ages in the late game for the Wish You Were Here dedication, and that gives a 100% tourism from national park. That sort of analysis is more of an overall tourism guide video, so we'll leave that where it is for now. Not gonna lie, I had written about 50% of this in a comment as a reply to the original question, but I decided to make it into a video because I figured all that effort to answer a single comment would be better put towards making a video that anyone could have. That's it for me. Hope you enjoyed the video. I love you all. If any of this confused you, watch the video again and leave a comment and I'll try to clarify. I love you all and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.